Swanns Way, part 12, starting on page 72, I believe. We remained sitting in front of the 1001 Nights plates, oppressed by the heat and especially by the meal. 4 upon permanent foundation of eggs, cutlets, potatoes, jams, biscuits, which she no longer even announced to us. Francois would add, depending on the labors in the fields and orchards, the fruit of the tide, the luck of the market, the kindness of our neighbors, and her own genius, and with the result that our menu, like the quatrefoils carved on the portals of cathedrals in the 13th century, reflected somewhat the rhythm of the seasons and the incidents of daily life. A brill because the monger had guaranteed her that it was fresh, a turkey hen because she had seen a large one at the Risenville-Lipin market, cardoons with marrow because she had not made them for us that way before, a roast leg of mutton because fresh air whets the appetite and it would have plenty of time to descend in the next 7 hours, spinach for change, apricots because they were still uncommon, gooseberries because in 2 weeks there would not be any more, raspberries that Mr. Swann had brought especially, cherries, the first that had come from the cherry tree in the garden over 2 years, in which it had not given any, cream cheese, which I liked very much at one time, an almond cake because she had ordered it the day before, a brioche because it was our turn to present it. When all of that was finished, there came a work of art composed expressly for us, but more particularly dedicated to my father, who was so fond of it. A chocolate custard. The product of Francois's personal inspiration and attention, ephemeral and light as an occasional piece into which she had put all her talent. If anyone had refused to taste it, saying, "I'm finished, I'm not hungry anymore," that person would immediately have been relegated to the rank of those barbarians who, even in a gift an artist makes of them of one of his works, scrutinize its weight and its material when the only things of value in it are the intention and the signature. To leave even a little drop of it on the plate would have been to display the same impoliteness as to stand up before the end of a piece under the very nose of the composer. At last my mother would say to me, "Now don't stay here all night, go up to your room if you're too hot outdoors, but get a little fresh air first so you don't start reading right after leaving the table." I would go and sit down beside the pump and its trough, often ornamented like a Gothic font, with a salamander which sculpted on the rough stone of the mobile relief of its allegorical tapering body, on the backless bench shaded by a lilac, in the little corner of the garden that opened through a service gate onto the Rue de Saint-Esprit, and from whose untended earth the scullery rose by 2 steps, projecting from the house like an independent structure. One could see its red paving stones gleaming like porphyry. It looked not so much like Francois there as a little temple of Venus. It overflowed with the offerings of the dairyman, the fruitman, the vegetable monger, who had come sometimes from quite remote hamlets to dedicate to it the first fruits of their fields. And the ridgeline of its roof was forever crowned with the cooing of a dove. In earlier years, I did not linger in the sacred grove surrounding it, since, before going upstairs to read, I would enter the little sitting room that my uncle Adolphe, a brother of my grandfather and a veteran who had retired with the rank of major, occupied on the ground floor, and which, even with its open windows, let in the heat, if not the rays of the sun, which seldom reached that far. gave off inexhaustibly that dark, cool smell of both forest and ancient regime that makes your nostrils linger in a daydream when you venture into certain abandoned hunting lodges. But for a number of years now, I had not gone into my Uncle Adolphe's room, since he no longer came to Combray because of a quarrel that had occurred between him and my family through my fault in the following circumstances. Once or twice a month in Paris, I used to be sent to pay him a visit, as he was finishing lunch wearing a plain, loose-fitting jacket and waited on by his servant, who was dressed in a work jacket of striped duck, violet and white. He would grumble, complaining that I had not come for a long time, grumble that we were abandoning him. He would offer me a marzipan cake or a tangerine. We would pass through a drawing room in which no one ever stopped, where no one ever made a fire, whose walls were ornamented with gilded moldings, its ceilings painted with a blue that meant it was to imitate the sky, and its furniture upholstered in satin as my grandparents', but yellow. Then we would go into what he called his study, whose walls were hung with some of those engravings depicted against a dark background, a fleshy pink goddess driving a chariot, standing on a globe, or wearing a star on her forehead, which were admired during the Second Empire because they were felt to have a Pompeian look about them, were then hated, and are beginning to be admired again for one reason, and one reason only, despite the others that are given, and that is that they have such a Second Empire look about them. And I would stay with my uncle until his valet came to him from the coachman to ask what time the latter should harness up. My uncle would then sink into deep meditation while his admiring valet, afraid of disturbing him by the slightest movement, waited curiously for the result, which was always identical. At last, after great hesitation, my uncle would have unfailingly uttered the words, "At 2:15, which the valet would repeat with surprise, but without disputing them. "At 2:15? Very good, I'll go and tell him." In those days, I loved the theater with a platonic passion, since my parents had not yet allowed me to enter a theater. And I pictured to myself so inaccurately the pleasures one might experience there that I almost believed that each spectator looked as though into a stereoscope at a scene that was for him alone, though similar to the 1,000 others being looked at, each one for himself, by the rest of the audience. Every morning I would run to the Morris column to see what shadows were being announced. Nothing was more disinterested or happier than the daydreams inspired in my imaginations by each play that was announced. Daydreams conditioned both by the images inseparable from the words that made up its title, and also by the color of the poster, still damp and blistered with paste, against which that title stuck out. Except for those strange words, like Le Testament de César Giraudeau, or Oedipe Roi, which were inscribed not on the green poster of the Opera Comique, but on the wine-red poster of the Comédie Française. Nothing seemed to me more different from the sparkling white plumes of Les Diamants et Les Corons than the smooth, mysterious satins of Le Domino Noir. And since my parents had told me that when I went to the theater for the first time, I would have to choose between these two plays, I tried to study exhaustively and in turn the title of one and then the title of the other, since this was all I knew of them, so as to attempt to discern the pleasure each one promised me and compare it to the pleasure that lay concealed within the other. I managed to picture myself so forcefully. On the one hand, a play that was dazzling and proud. On the other, a play that was soft and velvety, that I was incapable of deciding which I would prefer, as if, for dessert, I had been given the choice between Riz à la Bératrice and chocolate custard. All my conversations with my friends concerned these actors whose art, though unknown to me, was the first form of all those it assumes, in which art allowed me a presentiment of what it was, between the manner in which one actor and another delivered nuanced declamatory speech. The tiniest difference seemed to me to have an incalculable importance, and I would rank them in order of talent, according to what I had been told about them in lists that I recited to myself all day long, and that in the end hardened my brain and obstructed it with their immovability. Later, when I was in school, each time I wrote to a new friend during class, as soon as the teacher's head was turned, my first question was always whether he had been to the theater yet, and whether he thought the greatest actor was Gott, the second best Delaney, etc. And if, in his opinion, Febvre came only after Theron, or Delaney only after Coquelin, the sudden mobility that Coquelin, losing his stone rigidity, would develop in my mind in order to pass second place, and miraculous agility, the fecund animation with which Delaney would be endowed in order to withdraw to fourth, would restore the sensation of flowering and life to my newly supple and fertilized brain. But if the actors preoccupied me so, if the sight of the Mabon coming out of the Theatre Francais one afternoon had filled me with the ecstasy and suffering of love, how much more did the name of a star blazing on the door of a theatre, how much more did the sight at the window of a brougham passing in the street, its horses blossoming with roses in their headbands, of a woman I thought might be an actress, leave me in a state of prolonged disturbance. As I tried importantly and painfully to imagine her life, I would rank the most illustrious in order of talent: Sarah Bernhardt, La Burma, Portet, Madeleine Perron, Jean Samuel. All of them interested me. Now my uncle knew many of them, and also some courtesans whom I did not distinguish clearly from the actresses. He would entertain them at home, and if we went to see him only on certain days, this was because on the other days women came whom his family could not have met, or so at least they thought, since my uncle himself, on the contrary, was only too ready to pay pretty widows who had perhaps never been married, and countesses with high-sounding names, which were doubtless only noms de jour, the courtesy of introducing them to my grandmother, or even of presenting them with some of the family jewels, tendencies which had already embroiled him more than once with my grandfather. Often, when an actress's name came into the conversation, I would hear my father say to my mother, smiling, "A friend of your uncle's?" And I would think that the novitiate pointlessly endured for perhaps years on end by eminent men at the door of some woman who would not answer their letters and would ask her doorman to turn them away, could have been spared a boy like me by my uncle, who could introduce him in his home to the actress who, unapproachably by so many others, was for him an intimate friend. And so, using the excuse that a lesson which had been moved now came at such an awkward hour that it had prevented me several times and would continue to prevent me from seeing my uncle, one day, different from the day set apart for the visits we made him, taking advantage of the fact that my parents had lunch early, I went out, and instead of going to look at the columns of posters, for which I was allowed to go out alone, I ran to him. I noticed in front of his door a carriage with 2 horses, each of which had a red carnation at its blinkers, as did the coachman in his buttonhole. From the staircase I heard a laugh and a woman's voice, and as soon as I rang, a silence. Then the sounds of doors being shut. The valet came to open the door, and when he saw me, seemed embarrassed, told me that my uncle was very busy, probably would not be able to see me, and when he went to let him know anyway, the voice I had heard before said, "Oh yes, do let him come in just for a minute. I would enjoy it so much. In the photograph you have on your desk, he looks so much like his mother, your niece. That's her photograph next to his, isn't it? I would so like to see the boy just for a moment." I heard my uncle grumble, become cross. Finally, the valet showed me in. On the table there was the same plate of marzipan as always. My uncle had on his usual jacket, but across from him, in a pink silk dress, with a long string of pearls around her neck, sat a young woman who was eating the last of a tangerine. My uncertainty as to whether I should call her Madame or Mademoiselle made me blush, and not daring to turn my eyes too much in her direction for fear of having to talk to her, I went to kiss my uncle. She looked at me, smiling. My uncle said to her, "My nephew," without telling her my name, or telling me hers, probably because, ever since the difficulties he had had with my grandfather, he had been trying as far as possible to avoid any association of his family with this sort of acquaintance. "How much like his mother he is," she said. "But you've never seen my niece, except in a photograph," said my uncle, brusquely. "I beg your pardon, my dear friend. I passed her on the stairs last year when you were so ill. It's true that I saw her only for a split second, and your stairs are quite dark, but that was enough for me to admire her. This young man has her beautiful eyes, and also that," she said, drawing a line with her finger along the lower part of her forehead. "Does Madame, your niece, have the same name as you, my dear?" she asked my uncle. He looks like his father more than anyone," muttered my uncle, who was no more anxious to introduce them at a distance by saying Mamma's name than to do so at close quarters. "He is exactly like his father, and also my poor mother." "I don't know his father," said the lady in pink with slight inclination of her head. "And I never knew your poor mother, my dear. You remember it was shortly after your bereavement that we met." I was feeling a little disappointed, because this young lady was no different from the other pretty women I had sometimes seen in my family, in particular the daughter of a cousin of ours, to whose house I went every year on the 1st of January. Better dressed only, my uncle's friend had the same quick and kind glance. She seemed as open and affectionate. In her I found no trace of the theatrical appearance that I admired in photographs of actresses, nor of the diabolical expression that would have suited the life she must lead. I had trouble believing she was a courtesan, and I especially would not have believed she was a stylish courtesan, if I had not seen the carriage and pair, the pink dress, the pearl necklace, if I had not known that my uncle was acquainted only with those of the highest sort. But I wondered how the millionaire, who had given her the carriage and her house and her jewels, could enjoy squandering his fortune on a person whose appearances were so simple and proper. And yet, as I thought about what her life must be like, the immorality of it disturbed me, and perhaps more than if it had taken concrete form before my eyes in some special guise. It was so invisible, like the secret of some romantic story, of some scandal which had driven out of the home of her bourgeois parents and consigned to the public, which had brought to a bloom of beauty and raised the demi-monde to notoriety. This woman, the play of whose features, the intonations of whose voice, the same as so many others I already knew, made me consider her, despite myself, to be a young woman from a good family, though she was no longer from any family. We had gone into the study, and my uncle appeared somewhat ill at ease because of my presence, offered her a cigarette. "No," she said, "my dear. You know I've become used to the ones the Grand Duke sends me. I told him you were jealous." And from a case she drew cigarettes covered with gilded foreign writing. "Why, yes," she added abruptly. "I must have met this young man's father at your house. Isn't he your nephew?" How could I have forgotten? "He was so good, so exquisite to me," she said modestly and sensitively. But as I thought about what might have been my father's brusque meeting, which she had found so exquisite, I, who knew his reserve and his coldness, was embarrassed, as by an indelicacy he had committed, by this disparity between the excessive gratitude that was bestowed on it and his insufficient cordiality. It seemed to me later that it was one of the touching aspects of the role of these idle and studious women that they devote their generosity, their talent, a free-floating dream of beauty in love. For, like artists, they do not carry it to fruition, do not bring it into the framework of a shared existence, and a gold that costs them little, to enrich with a precious and refined setting the rough and ill-polished lives of men. Just as this one, in the smoking room where my uncle was wearing his plain jacket to receive her, generously diffused her soft and sweet body, her dress of pink silk, her pearls, the elegance that emanates from the friendship of a Grand Duke, so in the same way had she taken some insignificant remark of my father's, had worked it delicately, turned it, and given it a precise appellation, and in chasing it with one of her glances of the finest water, tinged with humanity and gratitude, had given back, changed into an artistic jewel, into something completely exquisite. "Come now, it's time for you to go," my uncle said to me. I stood up. I had an irresistible desire to kiss the hand of the lady in pink, but it seemed to me this would have been something as bold as an abduction. My heart pounded as I said to myself, should I do it? Should I not do it? Then I stopped asking myself what I should do so as to be able to do something. And with a blind and senseless gesture, divested of all the reasons I had found in its favor a moment ago, I carried to my lips the hand she was holding out to me. How nice he is! How gallant! Why, the boy's a bit of a ladies' man already. He takes after his uncle. He'll be a perfect gentleman, she added, clenching her teeth to give the phrase a slightly British accent. Couldn't he come have a cup of tea with me sometime, as our neighbors the English say? He need only send me a blue in the morning. I did not know what a blue was. I did not understand half the words the lady said, but my fear that there was some question concealed in them which it would have been impolite of me not to answer made me keep on listening to them with close attention, and this made me very tired. "Oh no, that's not possible," said my uncle, shrugging his shoulders. "He's very busy. He works hard. He wins all the prizes at school." He added in a low voice, so that I would not hear this lie, and contradicted. "Who knows? This boy perhaps will be a little Victor Hugo. Another Valuebel, you know?" "I adore artists," answered the lady in pink. "They're the only ones who understand women. Besides a few superior creatures like you. Excuse my ignorance, my dear, but who is Valuebel? Is it those gilded volumes in the little glass bookcase in your sitting room? You know you promised to lend them to me. I'll take great care of them." My uncle, who hated lending his books, said nothing in answer and took me into the front hall. Crazed with love for the lady in pink, I covered my uncle's tobacco-filled cheeks with mad kisses, and while some embarrassment he let me know without venturing to tell me openly that he would just as soon I not talk about this visit to my parents, I said to him, tears in my eyes, that the memory of his goodness was so powerful within me that one day I certainly would find the means to show him my gratitude. It was so powerful, in fact, that 2 hours later, after a few mysterious phrases that did not seem to me to give my parents a distinct enough idea of the new importance with which I was endowed, I found it more explicit to describe to them every last detail of the visit I had paid. I did not think that doing this would cause problems for my uncle. How could I have thought that, since I did not wish it? And I could not imagine that my parents would see any harm in a visit in which I saw none. Does it happen every day that a friend asks us to be sure to apologize for him to a woman to whom he has been prevented from writing, and that we neglect to do it, feeling that this person cannot attach any importance to a silence that has none for us? I imagined, like everyone else, that the brain of another person was an inert and docile receptacle, without the power to react specifically to what one introduced into it. And I did not doubt that in depositing in my parents' brains the news of the acquaintance I had made through my uncle, I was transmitting to them the same time as I wished to, the kindly opinion that I had of this introduction. My parents unfortunately deferred to principles entirely different from those I was suggesting they adopt, and they wished to appraise my uncle's action. My father and grandfather had some violent arguments with him. Of this I was indirectly informed. A few days later, encountering my uncle outdoors as he was passing in an open carriage, I was filled with all the pain, the gratitude, the remorse that I would have liked to express to him. Compared to their immensity, I felt that raising my hat should be shabby, and might make my uncle think I did not believe I owed him more than an ordinary sense of courtesy. I decided to restrain from that inadequate gesture and turned my head away. My uncle thought that in doing this I was following my parents' orders. He did not forgive them, and he died many years later without any of us ever seeing him again. That's the end of this part on page 82.